I'm very honored to introduce our next speaker, Alexander Bernstein. Alexander Bernstein is Leonard Bernstein's second child. So we are very honored to have a member of this wonderful family with us today. He's president of Artful Learning Incorporated and the founding chairman of the Leonard Bernstein Center for Learning. For 5 years, he taught at the Packer Collegiate Institute in Brooklyn, New York. He has studied acting, performed professionally, and worked as a production associate at the ABC News documentary unit. Bernstein holds a master's degree in English education from New York University and a bachelor degree from Harvard University. So I think we welcome Alexander Bernstein.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to say, first of all, how much my father would be so excited and fascinated. This conference has just been so far absolutely interesting and illuminating. And I'm a little fearful. All right. You're such smart people. I'm not in academia and I'm not a musician. I have a business. I own a business with my sister, which we oversee, but hire people who know much more about it than we do. I've done my share of work for peace over the years, but would hardly call myself an activist. But I am Leonard Bernstein's son, so I knew him well and know music pretty well. And I'm so very honored to be part of this meeting. I think to begin with, we should keep in mind the difference between making music for peace and being a celebrated musician, being active for peace. As far as making music for peace, my father in 1972 did a counter inauguration for a concert against Nixon's concert. He did Haydn's Mass at Time of War at the Washington Cathedral. He of course conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Berlin when the wall came down, things like that. As an advocate, he worked tirelessly, of course, during the Vietnam War, and his 65th birthday, he devoted all his activities to nuclear disarmament. So we have that distinction, but they do sometimes converge. But it's important to be clear about the distinction. I'll be quoting mostly from him and welcome questions from Connie and all of you anytime you want to interrupt, and of course afterwards. And I hope later on we can talk about Artful Learning, his educational legacy that's living on now in schools across the country, and I think is very germane to our topic today, particularly as far as empathy is concerned. Let's start with something from one of his young people's concerts with the New York Philharmonic. It was called What Does Music Mean? He said, "You see, no matter how many times people tell you stories about what music means, forget them. Stories are not what the music means at all. Music is never about anything. Music just is. Music is notes, beautiful notes and sounds put together in such a way that we get pleasure out of listening to them. And that's all there is to it." He does go on later in the program to talk about music having meaning in terms of feelings. But his compositions that were in any way anti-war had text, more often than not written by his collaborators or sometimes from the Bible. Here's Psalm number 2, verses 1 through 4 from his Chichester Psalms. Why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds asunder. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, and the Lord shall have them in derision. And then at the end of the piece, it's Psalm 133, verse 1, behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. In his Mass, a theater piece for singers, players, and dancers, he and Stephen Schwartz write during the Agnus Dei section, give us peace now, and we don't mean later. Don't forget you were once our creator. Leonard Bernstein had a lifelong argument, if you will, with God, not only in Mass, but in his first and third symphonies. He is struggling with the impossible idea that God allows war, period. In his more secular moments, his incredulousness of humanity's propensity to violence is shown most popularly in West Side Story, of course. But here is a song he wrote with Betty Comden and Adolph Green. It was sung by Barbra Streisand at an anti-war rally in 1969. And I have, if I can do this, I have Don Upshaw singing it. Otherwise, I'll just read you the lyrics. Hold on. No, I don't think this is going to work. Never mind. Too bad. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous song. It's called So Pretty. We were learning in our school today all about a country far away, full of lovely temples painted gold, modern cities, jungles, ages old. And the people are so pretty there, shining smiles and shiny eyes and hair. Then I had to ask my teacher why war was making all those people die. They're so pretty, so pretty. Then my teacher said and took my hand, they must die for peace, you understand. But they're so pretty, so pretty. I don't understand. Yet, he wasn't a pacifist, at least early in his life. He bravely and joyfully performed in Israel during the 1947 war, drawing such a crowd that it became an actual diversion, the attacking army thinking there was a troop deployment there. He was a devoted Roosevelt Democrat, unable to serve in World War II because of his asthma, but, of course, behind it all the way. After Hiroshima, apart from his efforts in Israel, a different story. I remember well my father's sheer disbelief that people could wage war like that. And he would slam the table. It just has to stop. And as if by force of will, in every concert he conducted, whether for peace or not, I think he was just trying to connect with people. That idea of empathy, I suppose. Here's a part of a speech he gave at the commencement exercises at Johns Hopkins in 1980. Every artist copes with reality by means of his fantasy. Fantasy, better known as imagination, is his greatest treasure, his basic equipment for life. And since his work is his life, his fantasy is constantly in play. He dreams life. What do we do with our minds when they boggle? We quickly put them to strenuous imaginative work. Mind-boggling time is the perfect moment for fantasy to take over. It's the only way to resolve a stalemate. And so I ask you again, are you ready to dare to free your minds from the constraints we, your elders, have imposed on you? Will you accept, as artists do, that the life of the spirit precedes and controls the life of exterior action? That the richer and more creative the life of the spirit, the healthier and more productive our society must necessarily be. If you are ready to accept that, and I'm not saying that it's easy to do, then I must ask you if you are ready to admit the ensuing corollaries, starting bravely with the toughest one of all, that war is obsolete. Again, by force of will. After JFK's assassination, he said what has come to be repeated all too often, I've noticed. We musicians, like everyone else, are numb with sorrow at this murder and with rage at the senselessness of the crime. But this sorrow and rage will not inflame us to seek retribution. Rather, they will inflame our art. Our music will never again be quite the same. This will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before. And with each note, we will honor the spirit of John Kennedy, commemorate his courage, and reaffirm his faith in the triumph of the mind. My father deeply believed that art and reason, art and rationality were inextricably connected. Maybe the baby of the two is empathy. It just occurred to me. One could not exist without the other. It's hard to argue if you allow for ambiguity to be the most human of human traits. Here's a quote from an interview he did in 1971. If I weren't convinced that there were a way to solve all this, the world's problems, I would simply jump out of the window and wouldn't worry about it anymore. But I am convinced that somehow, miraculously, through the rediscovery of man's rational power, maybe through the appearance of leadership, will be able to make it. That is why I'm really writing Mass. It's the only way I can contribute to what I hope is rationality in these times. And finally, a quote from an essay, This I Believe, that started in the 50s. This is from January 54. I believe in the potential of people. I cannot rest passively with those who give up in the name of, quote, human nature. Human nature is only animal nature if it is obliged to remain static. Human nature must, by definition, include among its elements the element of metamorphosis. Without growth, there is no Godhead. If we are to believe that man can ever be achieve a society without wars, that if we are to believe that man can never achieve a society without wars, then we are condemned to wars forever. This is, again, the easy way. But the laborious, loving way, the way of dignity and divinity, presupposes a belief in people and in their capacity to change, grow, communicate, and love. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alexander, for those comments. Your father, and by extension, your family, have been heroes of mine for a very long time. And I'm so inspired by the comments that you've read. I think I told you I read these to my students. And I have students who come away and say, oh, I had no idea. And they're really personally affected, especially by the This I Believe. And the In Memoriam of JFK. I mean, both of those are so powerful. I also talked to them about Artful Learning. And while we're here, I want to be sure to introduce you to Brenda Brenner. Maybe we can we change the focus here? So Brenda is the director of the violin program at Fairview Elementary, which is the school that has put in place Artful Learning. So if you can just meet, that would be useful. And then I wonder if you would like to talk about that, or perhaps the two of you, My first question is, as you see your father's remarkable legacy in action, are there ways you would like to see it broadened, expanded, continued? I already know the answer is yes, but if there's anything specific to talk about with artful learning or education, and maybe Brenda has a question.
I think as far as today's topics are concerned, Brenda, jump in if you like, but I see artful learning, which connects all the disciplines that kids K to 12 are learning, connecting everything through the arts and processes of the arts, creates a situation where they're always looking at something in the context of a different discipline. And there's a lot of collaborative effort among the teachers as well as the students, which is marvelous. It's not prescriptive in any way. It's not a curriculum that teachers are given. But it's just thrilling and gratifying and marvelous to hear students able to explain what they're learning and why they're learning it and what it has to do with something they're learning in another classroom. And it's so engaging, and obviously the test scores and everything are fine, but it just goes on beyond that. And you know, we don't have data on empathy or on courage or on all of the 6 points. But every time I visit a school, I see a school of kids pulling for one another and not fighting and not trying to be, you know, a lot better than their classmates, or, you know, they're always pulling for one another and working together for the most part. And it's extraordinary to see. Brenda, would you like to talk a little bit?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to you and Artful Learning, because I'm living it right now. This is our beginning of our 10th year next year, and it is an extraordinary program. I can say honestly that I see that the arts have become a sinew in that community to bring, as you say, the teachers and the students, and particularly the students who maybe aren't as successful academically. I see it's so moving to see children who you know are struggling and who are in the office before my class. And then they come and they play violin for half an hour with me, and there's no behavioral problems. There's, you know, they're amazing.
There are just so many.
I mean, we don't need data. I have it, you know. And
there are so many ways in, and you know, you're always going to have a third of a class just nail it, no matter how it's taught, and then a few are just going to, you know, mosey along. And then, but there's a billion ways that, you know, each kid learns differently, and so if you have that many different ways in, it makes all the difference in the world.
I think the other important thing is that by bringing the Jacobs School students, I have 32 that work with me over there, into that community, they learn as much or more than the students at Fairview School or the teachers, just because they're getting out of our little bubble of Jacobs and moving into the broader community and seeing how music and the arts can draw people together, can draw cultures together in a way that is so powerful.
Are you collecting data?
Yes.
A lot of true academic. I think this is a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
When is your research coming out?
I have 5 years worth of videos, of interviews, of test scores. I did the WISC for cognitive tests, pre and post treatment. So we have, I think within the next year I'll have something. I look forward to it.
And we have data also from our other schools, of course, and the scores. What's wonderful is the attendance goes way up. Parental involvement is stronger. It's all good.
And how about students in rural areas? To what extent is the project reaching them?
That's a great question. We have some schools in, I guess, I don't know, you can't say Napa is rural necessarily, but it is far.
I mean Spencer. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that.
Southern Indiana.
Bloomington, Minnesota is, it's a suburb, but there's a lot of kids who come from farms around there. It's hard to say, but that's a great question.
It's a great. I know that your sister has worked with Elsie Stama. I don't know if you have as well, but it is a great combinatorial approach there. And I love it that the artful learning that they're doing at Fairview is not just the violin; it's dance. You can. I don't.
Right. They do all sorts of drumming. They do drumming. They do keyboards. They do a show choir kind of thing now. So it's expanded in the last 2 years, and it's truly amazing what these kids are able to do.
Yeah. We are very aware in southern Indiana that we have 11 counties to the south of us that are a mess. And we'd love to see some expansion into that. And the university, I think, is trying to come up with something moving in that direction. But we've had some pretty big crises in southern Indiana. It'd be great to see that program moving out of Bloomington into lesser served areas, unserved areas, I guess is the way. Under but unserved. Yes, go ahead, Taylor. We can't hear you there.
I just wanted to say, Alexander, how wonderful it was for you to share those thoughts with us. Not only how they impact us all in our society and our purpose, but how they influenced and impacted you. It was just so moving to see that. So thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you one thing, and that is, you mentioned this 1971 speech where you talked about jumping out the window and ends with, "That's why I'm writing Mass." Can you tell me what that's from?
That's from an interview with John Gruen. And I don't have. Oh yes, here it was in Vogue. September. Vogue magazine.
There you go.
September 1st, 1971.
Wow. Great.
Wow.
Thank you so much. I want to refer to that over and over and over again.
It's a terrific quote. I wrote it down too. Really
I love this so pretty.
Yes.
I was moved by that.
I'm so sorry I couldn't.
I said I loved this so pretty quote from your father. And I was also struck by the line, "must die for peace." It's so metaphysical. Could you say something else about that?
Well, first of all, I have to say that
surprise.
It was he worked on that with his longtime collaborators Betty Comden and Adolph Green. Okay. So he doesn't get all the credit for that song. Okay. But no, I mean, it's just a wonderful line and ironic, and it was.
I just didn't know whether you had it.
That was the line, we have to destroy the village in order to save it.
If I could say something about this huge spectrum of influence that your father had across the world. I come from the country that was the part of the Soviet Union. It's Azerbaijan. And I have to say that your father has been my hero too. So Connie said this, but it's natural for Connie, right, to have Leonard Bernstein as your hero. I come from very far away, and the West Side Story is the piece of music and actually the film that we grew up with. It was like in every movie theater, and we went to watch it like many times. So my question is, if your father was aware of his being so popular in the Soviet Union, and then when I taught in the Baku Music Academy, I devised the master's thesis, and when thinking of the topic, I also suggested that we write with the student that we choose a West Side Story and the call for peace. And well, this student who was apparently like grew up in the, well, it was I think 1990s when I did that. And it resonated. And she was also so much into this music and into the topic, the subject that I suggested. Because Azerbaijan was at that time at war with the neighboring country. So the call for peace also resonated in her mind, although in a very different way. So I'm just what I'm trying to say is that this piece of music has such universal values that are depicted through this great music and great story. So yeah, and again, this question about what is the secret of being so popular in the Soviet Union? Did your father share any thoughts with you?
No, I don't. He maybe because his father came from there.
Yeah.
Or nearby.
Maybe. Yes, that is.
But he actually went there to conduct in the 50s. This was a mere year or two after they had taken away his passport. The House Un-American Activities Committee. And then all of a sudden, he is sent with the New York Philharmonic to conduct in Moscow and in Leningrad. And he conducted Shostakovich 7th, I think. And it was an incredible success and one of the highlights of his life, I think. And he got to meet Pasternak. I remember that was his. He and my mother both were so excited. But that was a great moment of, cross-cultural.
Extraordinary. Wow.
Yeah.
That is,
Wow.
That's something too.
And as far as West Side Story is concerned, we're hoping, it have been for a couple of years now, that there will be a new movie version coming out.
Really?
Very exciting, and it would be really fun to have everybody arguing over which one is better.
Will this one use Spanish for the film?
No, it'll be the original. No, it's being rewritten actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
Because I know the latest Broadway production.
Right, that used a lot of Spanish.
Spanish for the Puerto Ricans.
For the Puerto Ricans, yeah, and it was not particularly successful in the way it was done. I mean, it worked fine, I suppose, but they kept using less and less Spanish as the audiences dwindled because people just didn't understand it, and there was just no way to do super titles or anything like that.
Right.
Is Sondheim being involved in this in any way?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
If you can have subtitles in an opera, why not in West Side Story?
Excuse me?
If you can have
super
subtitles, it's because it goes back and forth. She just asked if you can have subtitles in an opera, why not in a musical? But I think it's because there's there was Spanish and English so intermixed, I can imagine.
Yes, and especially most of it was in the dialogue.
Yeah, yeah.
In opera, you can do it because they're singing it and it takes longer.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we're just on about 12.
We are. I just have one more quote I want to read from this, I believe, that you didn't read, because I think it really applies to all of us. And it is, we must learn to know ourselves better through art. And I'm wondering if that's, if that's maybe another one of those paradigms that we can set out there and say, okay, we don't have universality in understanding of the context of the music, but we do have universality in learning to know ourselves better.
Absolutely, and the essence of art is asking questions that don't necessarily have answers, but lead to other questions, and the humility of that we don't have the answers is important.
That's, yes. Yeah. Well, on that note, the humility of us not having the answers, I love that. We are moving to just a summarizing discussion with Ruth and Alain for the morning, and then I will go down and pick up lunches, which Merritt so graciously ordered for us. And I'm sorry I don't have lunches for all of you.
You didn't get my order?
Yeah.
And Olivia, you can go for sleep for an hour and a half and then come back.
Good idea. Could you keep my lunch in the fridge for 12 hours? 12 hours.
Sure.
So Ruth, do you and Alain want to come down to the end?
Sure.
And I will pick them up and bring them here. I think we should leave the room to eat them and find another space. I'm not sure they want us to eat in the library. Although maybe they don't care in here, do you know, Alex?
Some of them.
They relaxed the policy on eating in the library.
Oh,
Just in
Oh,
general.
good. That's great to hear.
Well, we are behind closed doors, so.
It's not like, we're.
So I'm going to actually leave it as a wide screen because this is an opportunity for us to just kind of collect our thoughts in terms of the overarching objective of our conversations today. But I thought I would first of all formally welcome Ruth Stone, one of the great minds in ethnomusicology, somebody who's been very instrumental in building the program at Indiana University and has been involved in a lot of interdisciplinary activity on campus related to music, technology, culture, anthropology, folklore, and music, and obviously music. An advisor to me as I was studying here. In fact, one of the very first people I met in Bloomington when I first arrived many, many years ago. So it's a real thrill for me to be sitting next to you and welcome you to our gathering. Do you have any thoughts? Would you like to launch forth into?
Well, I don't want to talk so much about specifics that people said. I thought we had 5 really important speakers who, as it were, tacked between very individual kinds of experiences, very personal things, and the global institutions. And the thing that kept coming to my mind as we were talking and I was listening to people was, how do we move between those? And I think Scott Shackelford, in his referring to the Ostrom workshop and the polycentric kind of model that they used, began to get at some of the things that Eleanor Ostrom saw in the world as ways of working. And I think, Olivia, you also alluded to it. So the question becomes, how do you take these really personal things, the things that Alexander is talking about with your father and kids at Fairview Learning, how do you take those and do you move from those to large-scale institutions, to the UN? UNESCO is an area in the arts where there's stuff going on. How do you move between those? How do you build effective structures, processes that we can navigate one of the things I was struck yesterday, I had a phone call from a former student, Austin Akigbo. He's a Nigerian. And Austin had just come back from West Africa. And I said, what were you doing in West Africa? I said, I saw things on your Facebook. He was working with UNESCO. Mm-hmm. UNESCO has a city that they designate each year, and Conakry, Guinea is the place. But he said that part of the work he did during the week he was there, and many of us think that UNESCO has a lot of flaws, right? And that the arts it hasn't worked. But what were they doing? They went by road from Mali, from Bamako, where there's been a lot of problems with peace and war and rebels. And they drove through the Futajalan Mountains all the way down to Conakry. He said it was an incredible trip because they came to these villages and people expected them to stop. And then they wanted to perform for this delegation from UNESCO. Oh. He said, I was so moved by what I saw. And he said, we'd got no sleep for 3 days because we moved a few miles and then we had to stop again and play. So, you know, here are just little examples in the world of how people are using music in important ways. And yet you have the dysfunctions that happen with UNESCO and some of the designation of intangible heritage. And we have all these examples. So how do we navigate between the large scale, where we can really make things happen, and the personal? And how do we scale up? Because I really feel after many years of being here at Indiana that we've got to scale things up. We can't just sit in our little circles. We can all feel good. We can arrive in Oman and we can listen to people playing the music and the Sultan has arranged it for us and we all feel very good about it. But what's going to happen tomorrow? How are we going to link? And we know because of the internet that people are being linked in ways that we never imagined. I was doing research in Liberia last January on the Ebola crisis. And I asked somebody, I said, so did you have any songs about Ebola during the crisis? And he said, just look at Facebook. You'll see it there. And I thought, what? You are on Facebook? So how do we harness technology? How do we harness the incredible talent we see here today among the scholars and scale up from the very personal to much broader things that will work without losing the value of individual ideas, without letting people be part of the decision-making process? How do we collaborate in ways that are both meaningful, but we don't lose the knowledge of the individual and the small group thing that happens? And how do we take into account the different backgrounds that people have and how that makes meaning different for them? Because they're not the same. We can't assume that we all share and create meaning in the same way necessarily. And so I think that's all I'd say at this moment, and maybe let Alain say a few things and we can come back.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Thank you. Well, you know, this is an extraordinary discussion on so many different levels, and it's been very interesting to listen to the stories, in a sense, that we've been telling to each other. You know, the 5 presentations have been really extraordinary in that they've been so different from each other, and yet we're also grappling, in a sense, with this exchange today that brings together 3 things which relate to each other historically and habitually in ways that are very different from each other. I think that for instance, music and peace as an arena of discussion is something that has been evolving for quite some time, and we've been delving into it and engaging with it and creating with it in amazing ways. And likewise, this burgeoning discourse about business and peace and the implications that flow from the perspective of the so-called business world and the issues of ethics, peace, and how businesses can perhaps think of it in a different way, think of what they do in a different way, in a more empathetic way. But the idea of, the arena of business and music, likewise, has its own history. But yet, when it comes to the dialogue that we're having right now, I haven't yet heard very much about how business and the practice of business impacts music, and vice versa, how music might impact the practice of business as it relates to the arena of peace. And in some ways, we're together as a community of between 16 and 25 people today, unpacking this view that gives us a very different way of thinking about things. For instance, for a while now, we've been meditating on what in fact are the intersections between music, business, and peace. And as you drill down to it, I don't think there's a single public music moment that is not informed by or impacted by some type of business. How you arrange a gathering, how people choose to get together, how they make instruments, how they translate what they're doing as musicians publicly, the forums, the concerts, everything else that's associated with it. And so I would be fascinated to see how we can more actively and purposefully connect what we're thinking about when we think about music and peace to business, and likewise, when we're thinking about the world of music and business, how that could perhaps translate to empathy and ethics and the purpose of what we're trying to do in the world in a broader sense. So it feels like uncharted territory and extremely exciting. One of the things that I would love to remind us all is that, in a sense, we're on a voyage of discovery today. The purpose of the summit is as much about sharing what we bring to the table and what we can share in terms of the stories that we tell to each other, as it is an exploration into the unknown, into a sense of what might be a set of conversations that bring those three things together. I've, for the past 4 years, been involved in the discovery of entrepreneurship, and have had quite a lot to do with concepts of entrepreneurship as they apply to the business world, and concepts of entrepreneurship that are emerging in the cultural world or in the music world that are both informed by business practice, but also have their own perspective, have their own view, have their own way of seeing things. And so, in a sense, my challenge to the business part of this conversation is, how can we think of business differently than the business world thinks about itself, through the lens of cultural exchange? How can we think of peace in ways that are perhaps different than we've thought about, through the lens of business? How can we think of music? And just sort of as much sort of pull apart what we're thinking about as we are putting it together. So in a sense, that's my reminder that today is as much an exploration as it is a sharing of preformed ideas and thoughts. I also want to just quickly mention that this is an exploration that will have legs, hopefully.
Yes.
And that will continue, and that will become programs, perhaps conferences, perhaps dialogue and exchange that will take place in many different arenas. So anything that you can do to help us develop these thoughts and ideas about what it might become is very much a part of what we're doing today as well. So I just wanted to remind everybody. So I think I'm between you all and lunch.
Well, why don't I go get lunch? You've asked huge questions, and they all can answer them.
So,
can I just
go ahead. Yeah.
make a little comment on the business thing? I would say that in my own experience as an academic, you have businesses like Caltex, Clemson, the places in Africa that I'm familiar with, who worked, where there's money that for tax purposes and so forth is difficult to repatriate. So they're happy to give it to us for some program. But I think the thing that Alain's talking about, the integration, is not happening there. You want 125,000? If you give me a quick description of what you're going to do, fine, take it. And it'll be very separate from the world that is big business.
Right.
Anglo-American, the biggest company in Zimbabwe, right? They were happy to welcome us there to stay in their guest house while we went off to work with musicians from the townships. It was like two worlds, and it almost was schizophrenic to beg for money during the day and then go back to the programs in ethnomusicology. And how do you bring some continuity and some better integration? So they're both aware of what we're doing, and it has some impact on business and what's happening there.
So Ruth, this is like really what you're talking about is that the corporate social responsibility arm of this activity seems to be a lot more separate from the day-to-day business dealings of a large corporation than we might think. You know, we like to think that CSR is a little more integrated into the business than it
so the question,
is.
the question becomes, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And it was just mind-boggling to go back.
It's interesting.
Over a period of several years to Zimbabwe, and even to get people from that corporate group to come and observe the musicians was a big leap. You know.
Yeah.
And you know some of that from living in South Africa.
Absolutely, and you know, I want to say that my entire, as I became aware of the world around me, I was really, I'll talk about it later.
Well, just another interesting example was going to South Africa. This was about the time that apartheid was breaking apart, and we were in Pretoria. Some IU representatives were in Pretoria at a luncheon with the with the American representative there, and he invited people from Europe and all these other countries, various countries of Europe, to come. And the lunchtime conversation was, okay, when apartheid is over, so what are you going to do? And everybody was competing with their discussions of, we're going to contribute this much, we're going to contribute this much. But how do you get involved in the larger life? How do you make things happen? Because just contributing money isn't enough.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say before I interrupted myself there was that as I became aware of myself as a practicing musician in South Africa during the end of the apartheid era, it became extremely apparent that what I was doing was being controlled, controlled by culture, controlled by politics, controlled by commerce, controlled by the business of music, and that one of the questions that I actually had for Alex about his father was, when you produce music that is so deeply meaningful to you as an artist, and then you become aware of how it's mediated through other people and other means, such as the business world or the political world, what sort of an impact does that have on your sense of what you've done? And I really grappled with that when I was growing up in South Africa, because I felt that there was this huge tension between what I felt I was doing as an artist and what I saw myself being represented as, as a way of maintaining the status quo.
Can I answer that a little bit?
Go ahead, yeah.
I'll be very brief. It occurred to me earlier also. As my father got more and more successful, he had big chunks of his life organized, over, he would be composing for a year, and then he'd be conducting for 3 years, and had like a 5-year schedule. And at a certain point, when he was maybe 60 something, I remember him just getting so frustrated that he had become an industry. And he said, "I'm so sick of Leonard Bernstein." And I think it's really important to what we're talking about. That especially more, it's become more and more so over the years. And culture, entertainment, media has become so profit-minded that I think to the detriment of the art itself.
And that's exactly what we need to be thinking about. I mean, one of the areas, because it just seems to me that one of the unpacked arenas of what we do as artists is the means by which we do what we do in the world of business.
Yes, absolutely.
We focus so much on the beauty and the creation and the form and the theory and the history of the theory and the narratives that come out of the artists, but we don't spend enough time really blending that and completing the picture with an understanding of what it is that we do in the business arena, and what does actually business mean.
Just 2 points along these lines that I think resonate to where we started on this. One is when Cindy and I did our work, we identified 3 things that businesses can do in order to contribute to peace. One is economic development, because poverty is linked to violence, and so the more you can provide jobs, particularly differentiate the market away from extractives, then you are making a contribution to peace. Second is following the rule of law, particularly avoidance of corruption. We did a study that shows that exactly those countries that are the most corrupt in terms of taking bribes and stuff like that resolve disputes by violence. Those that are the least corrupt don't, and so there's a whole rule of law. And then third, there's a sense of building community. One sense of community is external CSR. The more interesting one is how you develop your own business as being a community of itself, which has issues of gender equity, which has issues of voice, and also, interesting enough, has an interesting of small groups, which gets us back to some of these earlier comments, that it's a lot easier to be able to have a sense of the consequences of your action, to act in a way so that you're aware empathetically of how this is impacting. And the bigger the business, the bigger the organization, the easier it is to dehumanize, the easier it is to lose a sense of what that other person is, and things become numbers. And so this leap that Ruth started to talk about here when we started this discussion of going from the individual, the personalized, up to the bigger scale is exactly one of the issues that come up in terms of how to create ethical businesses and peace-building businesses. Because if you can keep it fairly small, or at least within subgroups, people can recognize that their actions matter. But the bigger, then you have a much difficult time of how you're going to universalize things, how you're going to have policies that include everybody and still connect to the individual, and that is a struggling effort. I think that, Scott and I have written about this polycentric model, which is a great theoretical model. I don't know exactly how it works out on this. So it's a common question, theoretical question of how you put those things all together, but it also is a bit of an answer that when you're looking at how you're going to mediate the artist work, and almost inevitably it's going to be mediated by some sort of a large corporation, which is exactly the kind of an organization that's going to have the most difficulty in order to be able to understand the humaneness of what is being created. And so it's a common thing. I can give you a zillion examples of businesses do really, really well, but there's also enough examples of how they do poorly that you need business ethics professors like me. And so, there's a big need for it too. It's a big issue, but there are also some counter examples of the way in which that it can be a positive thing as well. But size does matter. It does make a difference. Yes. And you have to think about, even if you're a large organization, can you break it into smaller organizations so you can capture that sense of community? Because if you don't, then it really does become market-driven and numbers-driven.
It's kind of that polycentricity that we were talking about.
Absolutely.
And I think that if you look at places like Africa, where you have a lot of aid coming in, you have a lot of NGOs coming in, so many times the procedures they have, the checklists they have, do not allow for local consultation. And so it can be something as simple as how are we going to work with this crisis we have, say the Ebola crisis. And what we found there was that people thought there's no time, we can't consult, we can't ask questions, we just have to act the way we know how to act. And it was local community action that in fact had one of the biggest impacts on how they got rid of the epidemic. And you have to keep consulting, you have to keep working And when you scale up, you have to keep checking to make sure you've got this local consultation. And music is one of the places where you have to keep that in mind as well, because it can run into the same problems.
Right. So co-creating solutions all the way.
All the way, and checking back and not being in too much of a hurry that you can't take time. Sometimes it takes time to do some of this consultation.
Any other thoughts?
Just
Go ahead. Yeah.
just before I take my 1:30, I wanted to check with Alexander that I heard properly that your father at some point, thinking about terrible things that happened, he banged his fist on the table and he said, "It just has to stop." Is that correct?
Yes. I don't remember exactly what it was in response to, but it was the way he reacted often to violence, to war. And it was just so far from his imagination that people could act this way, and he had to do something to make it stop.
Okay, I think this is a fabulous treasure you've given us, because personally I want to use it from now on, and maybe our whole group needs to use it, because in terms of corporate social responsibility, it's very complex, very sophisticated. Musical social responsibility can be also very difficult. Human social responsibility, very simple, just say it just has to stop, and Leonard Bernstein said so. You can use that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's really a treasure. Thank you.